Okay, here we go. So welcome everybody to the third GIKS roundtable. Did they know? A conversation about queer, ancient and modern. My name is Marco Formisano. I am professor of Latin literature at Ghent University. First of all, I would like to briefly introduce our venue, the GIKS. GIKS means Ghent Institute for Classical Studies, and it is not a department, but rather a transversal venue intended to bring together all classicists working in various fields and spread in different departments at Ghent University. Its function is to coordinate the numerous events happening at our university and to promote a number of initiatives devoted to reaching out and bringing scholars from all over the world to us. The GIKS team consists of the archaeologist and expert in ancient and modern viticulture, Dimitri van Limbergen, the Byzantinist Piril McLennan, whom you already met, and myself. Piril and I had the idea of organizing this particular roundtable within the series. Not surprisingly, perhaps this series of online roundtables was initiated during the hard lockdown of the previous years. The first meeting was devoted to the vegetal world, and its title was "Listen, There's Something You Need to Hear." The second was about things on their own terms, a conversation about things ancient and modern. And now we propose to discuss queerness and queer studies with our wonderful speakers. Now, as you might have noticed, our title is meant to provoke a fundamental uncertainty. Who are they? And did they know what exactly? Combining the picture with the title, of course, it looks like these people are looking at us with their stern, fin de siècle, Germanic gaze, as if they knew about us, about our own queerness, about our own desires, about our own sexuality. But it could be the other way around. Their naive faces make us ask, for example, whether they know how queer they were, or what was even possible for them to know, or how queer our own representation of them is. Certainly, I'm not going to solve the mystery which the title, the image, and their interaction are meant to produce. For my part, I would like only to say that the picture caught our attention because each face asks a question and each has a different story. This very human picture makes us curious about them, might make us wonder about the very intimate sphere, about their feelings, their desires, their sexualities. Anyway, with this, as with the previous roundtables, we would like to bring together a broad audience, not only of specialists, but also of those who are not familiar with queerness and queer studies. Piril and I asked our speakers to present their remarks with this broad audience in mind. In particular, we invite speakers and the audience to think of questions such as, are queer studies interesting beyond sexuality? Can scholars who do not define themselves as queer benefit from this discussion? More generally, is a personal involvement necessary in order to practice a queer methodology? And more, are there any approaches for which a personal involvement is actually not possible? As for the schedule of this event, we first will listen to each presentation, which will take approximately 15 minutes each. Then we'll take a short break of 5 minutes. And after that, we will return for the Q&A section. Piril and I are very happy to see that so many people have joined us. We received more than 130 registrations, among them some very prominent scholars working on gender and sexuality in the classics. Thank you to all of you for being with us. As a reminder, like our previous roundtables, this event will be recorded and then made available on YouTube. So please now, those who are not going to speak, turn off your camera and of course your micro. It is my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Oliver Baldwin from the University of Reading, currently in New York, if I rightly understood, Oliver, right. And he's going to talk about the classically queer and the queerly classical, the future of the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one little second. There we go. Fantastic. Good. Goedenavond, het doet me veel plezier om te meedoen van zo'n befijnd gezelschap te zijn. Bedankt aan de organisator van dit evenement en ik wou dat ik in het participant was nu. Tout d'abord, je tiens à souligner que mon structure théorique et mes lectures sont majoritairement en anglais. Je suis sûr qu'il existe des bibliographies en français, allemand, italien, flamand, etc., aussi bons ou meilleurs. J'espère pouvoir les découvrir aujourd'hui aussi et ainsi briser mon isolement et mon marasme anglophone. Thank you ever so much to all of you for coming. The present paper is actually not a paper at all. It is a music, a thinking out loud with you about many of the thoughts, perspectives, visions, and questions I am forming as my own work in queer classics takes shape. This in part responds to the original provocation for this roundtable, which I am honored and surprised to share with my fellow panelists. Thinking about ways in which queer studies may impact on classics, here in my paper Greece and Rome, but probably relevant to other locations and times. What follows is therefore my attempt to map a constellation of queer stars that may serve as sequins to a drag dress for classics. Since queer and queer studies remain cheekily elusive to definition, I should perhaps start by defining some grammatical uses of queer that may serve to approximate some definition. I'll apologize for these being indeed reductive and simplistic, and for repeating a queer commonplace here. But let's start with this. The nominal use of queer, that is, a queer, can generally refer to any of the subject positions placed outside or displaced by the gender-sexual coherent system of heteronormativity. That is, as a term to describe people falling under any of the LGBTQI+ letters. Thus, the study of queers, be these present or past, leads us to explore queer history, queer sociology, queer psychology, queer biography, but also how the heteronormative system, or any gender-sexual normative system, including Greco-Roman, polices its borders and structures. The adjectival use of queer, that is, a queer something, runs parallel and melanges with adjectives such as odd, aberrant, deviant, strange. Queerness can therefore illustrate moments of fissure or breakage or leakage in any normative system, be this temporal, academic, economic, racial, and of course, gender sexual, among others, thus demonstrating the construction, arbitrariness, and bias of normative systems. Although to queer as a verb finalizes my brief grammatical exploration, it in fact opens up many other options for queer, including grammatical. What are the uses of an attributive, gerundive, or participial uses of queer? Queering serves as a tool, an action, a practice with and through which to question, or queer's almost homonym, to query, deconstruct, surface, or subvert diverse normative constructions, including, but also beyond, gender sexual systems. Queer studies may therefore tentatively be understood as examining, analyzing, vindicating, and evidencing the lived experiences of queers, as well as the potential of queerness as a category and queering as a tool to illustrate, dismantle, and deconstruct the normative and its policing, both from its periphery and its center, as well as opening up potential for a queer world of non-chastising, non-normative, and liberatory possibilities. Since I am here, very generously, by the way, at the New York Public Library Theatre Archive in one of their offices conducting research, I should probably begin with what I dedicate many hours and many queer musings to, the beautiful animal, although I say it myself, that is the Queer Tragedy project I am working on, which I feel immensely fortunate to have coincided with in this space and time. The project Queer Tragedy is an international performance history of LGBTQI+ stage versions of Greco-Roman tragedy from 1969 to 2019. That is, a project about how queers on and off stage, in and out of a play, explore, exhibit, and vindicate queer desire, politics, identity, and existence at different stages in history and at different geographical locations. The project now counts over 55 performances worldwide, including at least 4 Belgian examples, and with your help and suggestions, these could of course be even more. The project is framed, as you can see here in these pictures, by 2 onstage tragedic same-sex kisses. The kiss between Dionysus and Pentheus in Sheshna's Dionysus in 69, and the 3 kisses between Orestes and Pylades in Milorao's Orestes in Mosul, staged 50 years later in 2019, precisely in the amazingly beautiful Ghent. I cannot describe how beautiful Ghent is, you must go, where we all virtually gathered today. In between, one can find a queer plethora of non-binary Antigones, trans Medeas, gay Orestes, and lesbian Oedipuses scattered through time and space. The kissing frame, if we want to call it that, is indeed chronological, but given its mirroring qualities, it also subverts chronological hierarchies. Could the New Yorker 1969-1968 kiss be seeding the future of the Ghentian kiss? And could the latter be reconstructing the former at a different juncture? The Dionysian kiss served to shock or titillate its audience, depending on one's queer leanings, as a transgressive and subversive performative act, channeling the queer potential of Dionysus. The 3 Argive kisses of 2019 served in order as a kiss of refuge for the queer actors playing Orestes and Pylades, as a kiss of companionship after avenging Agamemnon, and as a kiss of queer resistance and solidarity, as Pylades and Orestes kiss and embrace, while the chorus attempts to separate them after their sentence. The 2 tragedic kisses may also draw a movement from queerness as deviant, secretive, and subversive to building in the now a queerness of solidarity, companionship, and embrace. But it is, of course, not that easy. The mirror effect is repeated when we remember that the last resisting kiss on the right of your screen, before their sentenced execution, takes place in situ at the tower in Mosul from where Daesh executed gay men. The queer future, although imaginable and desirable, is yet to be constructed. Queer Tragedy clearly participates of a scholarly effort in mapping and analyzing queer receptions of Greco-Roman antiquity, particularly productive in the last 10 years. This effort has come to remind us of the great importance of Greco-Roman antiquity in constructing queer identity historically. It has come to map how classics and antiquity has served many queers of yesterday and today as a place of refuge, recognition, solidarity, exploration, and understanding. That is, as a queer origin and a queer utopia, in which to be their own Orestes and Pylades. This reception work has also helped to shine a light on the obscuring of queerness in ancient texts, as with Catullus' Coquille poems, an obscuring which much of our current philology is dependent on in many complicated ways. The normative status quo constantly seeks to undermine the emergence of a queer utopia, whether ancient or modern. However, more work needs to be done to build on existing scholarship. For example, we would amply benefit from moving beyond Oscar Wilde and The Love That Dare Not Speak Its Name and the current focus on pre-Stonewall queer reception and ask, what have Greece and Rome actually meant for queers after Stonewall in both political action and intimate affect? For example, on your right, what are the implications of Ron Vorter, an actor and gay activist seeking to play and playing in 1994 the role of Philoctetes at Kai Theatre in Brussels as a platform and structure to explore and expose on stage his own embodiment of the AIDS epidemic? But perhaps most importantly, we need to assess how the exploration of Greece and Rome as refuge, reference point, and utopia may be participated in discourses of homonormativity too, largely establishing white Western gay males as the queer subject by default, with celebratory notes of progress and evolution. By reinscribing subjects and subjectivities erased from normative accounts of history and reception, we should be careful not to be creating new erasures along class, racial, economic, and geographical lines. We need to both acknowledge set parameters of our work and or search for queer subjects and subjectivities engaging with Greco-Roman culture beyond the default remits of homonormativity. One of the pieces in the Queer Tragedy Archive, Harrison Rivers and She Would Stand Like This, is a transposition of Euripides' Trojan women to the siege suffered by a Harlem queer family of color headed by their trans mother Hecuba at the hands of AIDS and intersectional oppression by heteronormativities, alliances with racism, capitalism, and class. I hold this production very close and very dear, so it permanently reminds me that I should not fall in the trap of believing that the be-all and end-all of queer tragedy is a gay male kiss, be this Dionysian or Gentian. One of the primary productivities of reception to the broader discipline of classics is that it functions as a boomerang. By analyzing how queers of the present relate to Greece and Rome and its gender sexual difference, we may come to ask if and how queerness manifested, developed, or was and has been theorized in the ancient world. Furthermore, present and ongoing theorizations by queer theory may pose new frameworks for the study and understanding of Greek and Roman gender and sexuality. I admit this is not my area of expertise, but I am very interested as a classicist myself. How may Megillus in Lucian be read differently to a previous assumption of butch lesbianism if we take into account the importance of gender self-determination in trans politics and theory? As Leanna is baffled with Megillus not fitting the gender norms she is so stiffly attached to, Megillus asserts, "No, Leanna, I am all man," adding a generously pedagogical explanation of gender assignation at birth. "No, Leanna, I was born a woman like the rest of you, but I have the mind and the desires and everything else of a man." I do not intend here to minimize the problems derived from this being a literary text, the potential intentions of Lucian or his readership, for which there is sadly no scope here. I am simply using the case of Megillus as a swift illustration of how the evolution of queer and trans theory can provide new frameworks for understanding ancient queerness, and with it the gender sexual normative discourses and conceptions of Greece and Rome. As said, queerness brings fissures, breakages, leakage to normativity. But I know what many of you are thinking: anachronism. And yes, who doesn't love a queer villain? I have little time to go through this in detail, but I do have a few quick ideas. Firstly, the use of frames does not mean the exact application of them. They can be adapted. It is true that Greece and Rome did not use the same heteronormative binaries we do, but they did have gender sexual normativities of their own, graphed, as we know, largely along passive and active sexual potentialities. Secondly, classics is by nature, to what degree may be of course discussed, anachronistic. Inasmuch as we have to interpret the lacunae and the otherness of antiquity, we are ourselves bringing our own perspective, decisions and biases, however objective these may pretend to be. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, invoking anachronism cannot be a chastising call that forecloses serious discussion. In a queerly ironical sense, you would be evidencing your own anxieties in policing disciplinary normativities. I love that picture, by the way. I want to end my musings with a reflection on how queering as a tool may add to philological work, as evidenced, for example, in the extraordinary theory and practice of deep les philology by Ella Hazelwood at UCLA. I here understand philology in the most extensive of terms. I'll repeat again. I here understand philology in the most extensive of terms, inasmuch as ancient literary, historical, artistic, and material objects of study are texts whose meanings we work to determine. Many of the tools used by queer theorists and scholars in other academic fields are of great productive use for classics. Queer classical philology may mean bringing new attention to non-extra para sub-canonical texts, thus revealing not only how hierarchical understandings of value, interest, and relevance have worked to establish their oddness, strangeness, queerness, but also how antiquity may appear differently composed through their study, that is, how they may queer antiquity. Queer classical philology may also help to counteract, subvert, and deconstruct established, that is, normative, disciplinary forms of reading that continue to inform the way we access and interpret ancient texts. Queer forms of scholarship, such as collaborative writing, comparative philology, non-teleological relations to time and meaning, can open up a new path for understanding Greece and Rome. Finally, many of the issues occupying queer theorists and scholars, such as queer temporalities, affect, solidarity, or ontology, can inform different ways of reading texts and classics, bringing enriched possibilities to the field. All these possibilities of a queer classical philology are beginning to germinate in many different queer classical meadows, such as Queer Euripides, which you can see there, edited by Mario Teló and Sarah Olson, presented only last week, in which you can find many queer readings of Euripidean and para-pseudo-counter-Euripidean plays, including my own on Rhys's and Hasselwood's great chapter on Iphigenia and Aulis, and also Nancy Rabinowitz's chapter as well, who's in the audience I've seen, alongside, of course, many, many others. I hope that my ramblings has helped many of you to situate a fraction of the possibilities awarded by queer studies to classics, and that it has provoked your own musings and desires for queer practice. However, we must not forget that within this practice, there's also a duty of care and solidarity. This is not only evident in the need for networks such as Queer and the Classical, which you can see a picture of here and you can Google, it's easy to Google, or collaborations such as Queer Euripides. It must also be evident in our own actions with our students and communities inside the classroom and beyond. It is essential that you understand the perspectives and lived experiences of queer people around you. However, do not put the burden of queer education on them, but on yourselves. The relationship should be one of exchange, solidarity, understanding, and work, not one of exploitation of time, energy, and resources. With this in mind, and with all the many possibilities that the queerly classical and the classically queer can offer us all, I hope we can begin to enact now a queer classical future to come, kissing, embracing, and resisting as Orestes and Pylades in Ghent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver, also for this final invitation. And yeah, I'm glad that you liked Ghent so much. I wanted to just remind the speakers that we asked you kindly to introduce yourself. Oliver, maybe would you like to say something about
Well, I kind of try to weave it in it. So, you know, I'm currently working on the Queer Tragedy project. So I try to weave it in.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm happy also to see that Cleo Carastro is with us. So she joined in. Hi, Cleo. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry about that. So let me introduce the second speaker, who literally really doesn't need any kind of introduction, David Halperin from the University of Michigan. And the title is Why Classics Doesn't Need Queer Studies. Thank you, David, for being with us.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you for including me. Hi, everybody. I only have a few brief remarks to make. I'm overwhelmed by the topic of the roundtable, the question of what the ancient world has to do with queers or queer studies, all the questions that you posed, Marco, about queer theory or queer studies themselves. All of these are quite large, overdetermined questions. I've been writing about them for a good 35 years at least. As you said, my name is David Halperin. I've recently retired from the University of Michigan, where I taught English, really, along with cultural studies of various kinds and queer studies. My work as a classicist had to do first with Hellenistic poetics, then with the philosophy of Plato, and then with the history of sexuality in ancient Greece, and then with lesbian and gay studies more generally. I have the disadvantage of having been present at the creation of queer theory, in the sense that I was an invited participant in the conference called Queer Theory that was held at the University of California in Santa Cruz in February of 1990, and directed and organized by Professor Teresa Del Reitis. And because I was present at that conference, I've never actually believed in queer theory as a thing, since there was no such thing as queer theory when that conference took place. The conference was not a conference on an existing body of theory, as if there was something equivalent in queer studies or lesbian and gay studies to Marxist theory or psychoanalytic theory or critical theory. It was a deliberate provocation, almost a kind of joke, and an incitement to theorize queerly, as well as to highlight everything that was queer about theorizing sexuality. So I've never really been able to believe in queer theory as a thing. It's something that sort of had to be filled in after the fact, when it was clear that this notion was very intriguing to a lot of people and was simply too lucrative to give up. My own interest has been in the queer movement and in queer studies and what those movements have been able to make happen. So with that as kind of just kind of informal introduction, let me just make a few remarks that come to mind when I try to account for how overdetermined the question of the queerness of the Greeks, the question of the queerness of the Greeks seems to me. I mean, the Greeks are so notoriously queer that they've become a kind of standing joke. When Sappho was not busy celebrating the beauty and desirability of the women and girls whom she loved, Socrates and Plato notoriously were drooling over various boys distinguished more by their good looks than by their philosophical acuity. The formula Greek love verges on an obscenity, and any attentive reader of personal ads knows that Greek signifies not an ethnicity, but a sexual inclination. A complete account of how that situation came to be would be coextensive with Western European history itself, so I'm not going to attempt such a thing here. I just want to make one remark about recent efforts to conscript the ancient Greeks into service as avatars of contemporary queer identity. There is an obvious but uninteresting sense in which all pre-modern human subjects are queer. All human beings who were formed in societies that predated our own and whose feelings were not regulated by the norms or the systems of normativity that govern ours are necessarily queer, at least when they're viewed from a modern perspective. For their inner lives were not guided by that internal gyroscope we call sexuality, whether homo or hetero, which defines who we are by what we desire. Instead, pre-modern subjects led erotic lives structured by a number of social forms and patterns, some of which do not correspond to the criteria that most of us consider natural and normal ways of ordering sexual psychology. Permissible and possible objects of desire and modes of intercourse were determined in pre-modern times by hierarchies of gender and class, by differences among the partners, not only in sex, but also in age and status, in group membership and degrees of social belonging, by varieties of physical appearance and personal style, by occupational and religious identities. So the desires and behaviors of people in earlier times tend to cut across our categories of both heterosexuality and homosexuality. As such, pre-modern subjects inevitably qualify as odd, bizarre, nonsensical, incomprehensible, in a word, queer. It's not wrong then to label ancient Greek erotic life queer, but it's not very informative either. In fact, I think it's pretty pointless. There's not much cognitive or analytic payoff, let alone a political one, in assimilating ancient material to our own categories of the normal and the deviant. It's just too easy. It's like shooting fish in a bowl. So rather than trying to make the newfangled theoretical term heteronormativity fit the organization of sexual and social life in the ancient Greek world, and to identify as queer all those who contravened its dictates, I think it would be better to undertake instead a careful, informed historical inquiry into the social articulation of sex and gender categories and relations in classical antiquity, so as to delimit the historical reach of our currently fashionable critical concepts, and to show how sex and gender norms actually operated in a society in which heteronormativity, as we now understand it, was arguably absent. As Oliver just pointed out, there were plenty of sex and gender norms in ancient societies. They just don't map very easily onto ones familiar to us. Not only would such a procedure encourage us to accept the destabilization of our own categories of sex and gender, and to enable the ancient material to have the salutary effect of demolishing the specious self-evidence of contemporary theoretical commonplaces, it would also permit us to ask more precisely what counted as deviant or queer according to ancient Greek notions of good and bad sex. In many ways, the Greeks were ahead of us. They lived in a world in which the display of the male body in athletic competition was not an incidental and embarrassing byproduct of spectator sports, but a source of fame and glory. A world in which beauty contests could routinely feature male participants, and in which even Homer, recounting the siege of Troy, could single out for mention the most beautiful men in the Greek army. I should warn you, I hope I won't spoil anybody's pleasure in Homer if I let you know that Achilles actually came in first in Homer's account of the most beautiful men in the Greek army. Not a big surprise. Already in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, Greek writers argued about whether Achilles and Patroclus in Homer's Iliad were lovers, and if so, who was the top and who was the bottom. In other words, they were already performing queer critiques of Homer. Already in the 4th century, Plato composed a dialogue, the Symposium, which is the first work in human history to theorize erotic desire. It offers not only the first theory, but the best theory of erotic desire. Even more remarkable from my point of view, that theory is couched in an entirely all-male context. All subsequent theories of erotic desire have simply duplicated Plato's theory, and the best modern theories, such as Proust's, have expanded and elaborated it. The one major modern departure from it, the understanding of erotic desire in terms of sexuality, has been a catastrophe as an account of desire, and it's now pretty much collapsed. All of which is to say that the ancient Greeks don't really need queer theory or queer studies. They were theorizing queer desire just fine on their own. It's the study of the ancient Greeks that has made it possible to develop and to elaborate for more than 200 years now, if not longer, a field of queer studies. It's the Greeks who have given us queer studies. It's not we who stand to benefit by studying the Greeks in the light of queer theory. So it's, to explain my title, it's rather queer studies that needs the Greeks, and that has never really been able to do without the Greeks, and that has found plenty of impetus in the study of classical antiquity. So I think that's really all I have to say for now.
Thank you so much, David, for this very interesting and very clear thoughts. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Cléo Carastro from École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, who is going to talk about out of the shelves, icons and cosmologies in queer classics. Cléo?
Thank you very much, Marco. I'm very sorry for this technical problem I had. I try to share my screen and I hope it works. So, since my undergraduate years in Italy and through my graduate studies in France, the École des Hautes Études in the US, at the Johns Hopkins University, I always desired to combine my philological training with anthropological questioning. And while I started working within social sciences in Paris, I was also introduced to comparative thinking by Marcel Detienne, first in Paris and then in Baltimore. Julia was there, and it's a very nice occasion to say hello to her and then to listen to her speech. In the late 90s, the wonderful Milton Eisenhower Library in Baltimore gave me access to a great amount of publications on anthropology, gender, and the new queer studies. I remember I spent hours during my evenings reading books between mobile shelving. I took off the shelves many of them, but I must confess, I was often unsatisfied, even disappointed, because I didn't find then what I was looking for. Anthropological literature on third gender, for instance, seemed to hold up a mirror to the Western imagination through the kaleidoscope of societies where gender relations were not necessarily binary. Anthropological researchers were often looking for legitimacy of queer activist claims in non-Western societies, instead of looking for their cosmological configurations. Maybe it was a matter to go out of the shelves that resemble the closet. Between the shelves and the closet, we see there is an issue on spatiality of knowledge. Throughout my scholarly work, I've tried to put into question modern issues on anthropology of religion, but also on gender, starting from an anthropological and comparative displacement, in order to learn to see with the ancients. So, does queer classics exist? And if yes, how to trace its perimeter and its agenda? First of all, I take queer theory from a broad point of view, and I consider it as a space for debate, even an arena, which emerged within the counterculture movement in the US in the 90s, and which aims to respond to a political injunction to defend margins and to fight cis and heteronormativity. While activists of queer nations and ACT UP proposed a subversive vision against the homologation of gay and lesbian communities to a state normativity, scholars, and David mentioned Teresa de Lauretis, contributed in different ways to this fight for a recognition that often passes by a refusal of the recognition of the state normativity. In the last 30 years, the political agendas evolved, of course, and transgender voices are more and more heard on this arena. Although sexuality has been a starting point for debate, I do think that the scope of queer approach doesn't allow itself to be enclosed in an analysis of sexualities, because of its ambition to carry a broad political glance on the state of social relations, notably by the intersectionality dimension and the attention paid to different forms of marginalization. So who am I to talk about queer studies? I'll be clear, my starting point is social sciences, à la française. I'm inspired by a Durkheimian approach and the emancipatory function of the social sciences, which entails they cultivate at the same time essential and complex relationships with all types of individual and collective identities. You probably know that queer studies play a consistent academic role in the US, which is not the case in France, where we rather talk of gender studies because of a different academic political agenda. So I'm talking about and from the French situation, where the question of queer classics doesn't arise for the moment, and therefore engaging in a visionary exercise, in dialogue with other academic emerging voices. One of them is Blake Gutt, with Alicia Spencer Hall, the edited volume, which is very much inspiring for our conversation today, because what they write for Middle Ages could also be helpful for classics. The editors make explicitly their political purpose to contribute to the flourishing of trans lives in the present through uncovering the trans past and demonstrating that trans people not only existed in the Middle Ages, but contributed to and shaped the societies in which they lived. Against the transphobic rhetoric that portrays trans identities as abnormal or unnatural, the editors claim that non-normative gender has existed throughout recorded history. This strategy both constitutes, I quote, a powerful rebuttal to transphobic claims and provides modern transgender individuals with a sense of temporal continuity, end of quote. But then my first question is, does naturalization of transgender lives work as the best foundation for queer theory related to ancient societies? I don't think so, even though I'm aware that this is a risky answer in the current arena. But let's see how this naturalization works and what it implies. There is an intensive work of disclosure here, uncovering the trans past, discovering trans potentials in the past. This is a matter of revealing what has been concealed. And in this work of revelation, some classicists have already engaged with symbolic figures like Tiresias, Caeneus. So naturalization is manifested by a familiarity that trans and queer scholars can feel in classical or medieval texts. But is this work of archaeology something like a genealogical exercise to legitimize the contemporary situation? Do we need authoritative figures in the ancient repertoire? David already warned us some years ago against the temptation of looking for models. But it seems that people and even scholars need that. It's a social reality and a social fact. Some queer classical scholars insist on the importance of affective power of this work of recognition that makes possible to build a community. It was an article in Eidolon published in 2019. And this is a point I'd like to develop, since this claim deserves to be taken seriously. An icon is a powerful image, which is charged with a force which is able to make things happen, and which is related to the invisible world. In the modern use of the term, the religious value of icons is concealed or even erased in favor of a weak sense of symbolic power. If it's a matter of icons in queer classics, this is in the last sense, of course. It is a matter of images or figures which are good for the identification process. But can we be satisfied with the search for trans-feminine or trans-masculine figures to identify in the mythological corpus, like again, the diviner Tiresias or the warrior Caeneus? The problem with this is the high level of variability in the forms and ways of identification of such figures. Take the Ovidian Caeneus, which has been described as a lesbian icon, then as a figure of transvestitism, and more recently as a transmasculine character. Where to put the accent? And if you consider Virgil's narrative, who describes Caeneus as a masculine figure among feminine ones in the underworld, presenting him as an assigned female at birth, and then back to feminine appearance at his death because of destiny, fato. Would we say that Caeneus detransitioned? Or did Virgil naturalize Caeneus assigned gender at birth? So I'm not sure that this path is so productive. Another interesting case is Sophocles Antigone, which is considered by Judith Butler as an almost queer figure or icon. Antigone is a subversive figure. She refuses reproduction. Her name is speaking in this sense.
It's me on the end. I actually had an email from Bolton. I asked them how they'd set up their
I
microphones and what have you.
think it's a problem of microphone.
Yeah, problem we experienced already before, and I don't know how. Oh, okay, it's fine. Sorry about that, Cleo.
No problem. The name of Antigone, as you know, is very speaking in this sense. Antigone against the family, the reproduction. So she claims freedom of action and speaks as a man against Creon's power. In a global situation where neoliberalism extols an ideology of freedom of action that is in reality the freedom of a small group of white, male, heteronormative regime defenders, we nowadays like to think of freedom in terms of emancipation. And this may seem paradoxical in a sense, because the emancipation adopted by neoliberalism draws on a Marxist source that was developed to think about the liberation of peoples. In this perspective, Antigone can appear as an emblematic figure, even the archetype of emancipation. But from the outset, this type of political and activist reading leaves the shadows of the modern on the ancient. And the first task will be to liberate Antigone from the moderns. As I argued a few years ago, the problem with this interpretation is that it neglects the rhetoric of the text, which insists on the collective effort she makes to be not her own voice, but the voice of a community linked by family ties, a community that corresponds to the whole city against the tyrant Creon. Antigone's claim is clear. She is born of love, not hatred, in the translation by Anne Carson. Antigone's claim of following the divine laws against human laws, and her way of putting the accent on surfilain, to love with, help to leave the idea of personal emancipation and lead us to the cosmological aspects of her claim, which is a way of acting. The cosmology of a group, I quote Vincent de Combe, is not a simple system of the world intended to answer the interrogation of an intellectual curiosity. This system has a practical function. It allows the members of the group to orient themselves in the life, therefore to explain also mutually their facts and gestures. Cosmology doesn't fix only a physical order of the forces, but a moral order of the forces which are treated. The cosmology declares an order of justice. The cosmology can be defined as the foundation of the rhetoric of the group. So if we shift from icons to cosmologies and ways of acting, a new and unexpected landscape opens before us. Almost nine years ago, I was in Cornell at a workshop on Homeric poetry. Froma was there, and I presented a paper whose title was As a Woman. It was a question of transgender experience of agency by Odysseus. Since the Hellenistic period, the scene of Odysseus weeping as a woman in the bouquets amongst the Phaeacians, when listening at Demodocus' song about the wooden horse and the sack of Troy, has attracted the commentators' attention. Although scholiasts and a large part of modern scholars have focused on the pathos of this Homeric simile, I propose to analyze Odysseus' tears in terms of cultural response to the Aedic performance, rather than a pure emotional device of it. Because he is highly concerned by the song as one of its main characters, Odysseus cannot rejoice like any other person of the audience, but through an embodiment of female funerary behavior, he cries high and shrill, liga cucuei. Accordingly, the analysis was twofold. On the one hand, by recalling the encounter with the sirens, I focused on the funerary value of their song and its sound effects. And on the second hand, following the tears traces, I intended to question the dynamics of the simile that allows Odysseus recovering his own identity through whim spectrum. There is after Odysseus' tears this is after Odysseus' tears that he revealed his identity to the king Alcinous, and that he started the narrative of his troubles. This is a very short example, maybe too short, I'm sorry for that, but we lack of time, in order to see how a cosmological approach paying attention to modes of action and ethical questions can open a different landscape we were waiting for at the beginning. To conclude, if icons seem necessary, we should remember that the critical and reflexive approach of the social sciences cannot, even on a provisional basis, place its steps in those of the entrepreneurs of strategic essentialism, who are taking in a work of political construction. It is that which carries the notion of deconstruction. But social sciences must also keep in mind the fact that the question of the address arises in a crucial way today to answer this feeling of betrayal of the promise of emancipation that we can be reproached. The production of emancipating knowledge that we have in line of sight seems not to answer the expectations of activist political agenda in search of icons, following the logic that by naturalization one makes community and one thus reaches social recognition. So, if icons are important for their affective power, we can say that there is room for them, but in the sense of maybe event images, where images are capable to presentify past and future at once, and to create a special kind of attention. That said, I would add that we must be aware of cosmologies, and above all, of modern cosmologies, where in search for naturalization, we lose the specificity of sociocultural configurations of thought and practices. To put it with Stratton's anthropology, it would be rather a displacement that gives us a radicality of point of view that is vital to see beyond our cultural presuppositions, and embrace other visions. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleo, for this very intriguing presentation, also complex. And I now give the word to Kai Merkley, from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The title of their talk is Undoing Gender, Writing Trans History in Antiquity. Kai, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, perfect. I think we're ready to go.
Thank you.
So my name is Kai Merkley, and I'm currently working on writing a dissertation. Broadly, it's a trans history based off a handful of texts from Imperial Rome. This talk is my first opportunity to try and present the methodology and really the raison d'etre of the whole project to a general audience. So I'm really looking forward to this. Growing up in a very conservative and very religious household where transgender didn't even exist as a term, my relationship to this project is very personal, and I really don't feel like I can separate myself or my desire to make the world a better place for those who are trans from my work. For I feel that to study texts, to be a philologist, is really about studying stories. And the stories that we tell matter so much. In fact, I'd like to frame my talk today around a short excerpt from an essay by Ursula K. Le Guin on the power of stories. She says, so long as culture was explained as originating from and elaborating upon the use of long, hard objects for bashing and killing, I never thought I had any particular share in it. The society, the civilization they were talking about, these theoreticians, was evidently theirs. They owned it, they liked it. They were human, fully human, bashing, sticking, thrusting, killing. Wanting to be human too, I sought evidence that I was. But evidently, I was either extremely defective as a human being or not human at all. That's right, they said. What you are is a woman. But if it is a human thing to put something you want into a bag or a basket and then take it home with you, and then later on take it out and eat it or share or store it up for winter, if to do that is human, then I am a human being after all. Fully, freely, gladly, for the first time. It is the story that makes the difference. It is the story that hid my humanity from me, end quote. So today I'd really like to present a talk that is all about the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that hide away our humanity. And I propose that gender is one of those stories. As a story, an entire narrative trapped in a single word, gender is an exceptionally difficult word to define. Even when the definition, as here, gender is, most often defined as here by a binary and linked to anatomical sex. Even when the definition attempts to turn outside the binary, gender is defined as male, female versus not male, not female, as here. Even more sophisticated attempts at explaining gender fall into the same trap very easily. In this diagram, gender is defined as consisting of gender identity and gender expression, a neat little tautology defining gender by gender. Gender identity is conformity or rejection to the normative ideals surrounding womanness or manness. It seems like a neat little solution, but manness or womanness are just symbols that encapsulate normative ideals. There are attempts to create a fantasy that there is a clear objective reality behind all of these categories. I see gender as an empty system of categorization as norms, as the story we tell ourselves to define which boxes people are allowed to exist in. I like thinking of gender as the result of a dialectic between an individual's desired place in society and the expectations of the other, that is, society's norms, expected behaviors, and disciplinary mechanisms. As this dialectic is written on and mediated by our very bodies, it becomes a matter of life and death. Halperin in Transgender goes so far as to see gender as an act of supplication, a high-stakes plea of requesting a gender and hoping that the plea is granted. The story of gender provides a reason to reject those pleas. In point of fact, defining a category requires rejections, exceptions, and exclusion. Gender says, quote, "That's right, but what you are is a." This dialectical approach to gender can help us see the radically different ways that identities are defined, manipulated, and controlled within different historical and personal contexts. For the historian, recognizing gender as fluid and changing provides one way to step outside of the definitions of gender in the here and now. A necessary step if we are to really contemplate just how big and all-pervasive gender is. As Legacy Russell notes in Glitch Feminism, gender is a hyperobject. It's too big to be seen. I find the concept of gender as hyperobject very useful. The hyperobject as a term was invented by Timothy Morton in order to help make objects. In Timothy Morton's work, objects like climate change or styrofoam, objects that are so big and all pervasive, not a piece of styrofoam, but all the styrofoam that has ever existed on Earth, that they are nearly impossible for us to grasp or even see. Notice how gender can act as one of these hyperobjects. Gender is viscous. It sticks to us. The more we try and avoid it, the harder it sticks. The more we're policed and our gender identities are controlled. Gender is non-local. We can't recognize gender from a single example. It's phased. We treat gender like it's a concrete object, but that's because we can't see the whole thing. The experience of gender of a white cisgender woman and a Black transgender woman in the United States is a very different experience. And gender's effects extend far beyond and between seemingly disparate objects. Gender makes things about gender, like the way we order coffee or the kind of toy that a child has, suddenly be about gender after all. Gender touches on everything we tell ourselves, provides a story for every person, for every moment. It strives to always have the answer. The illusion we tell ourselves is that this story never changes. The gender is a concrete object. To write trans history, we need to shatter the illusion. And it's surprisingly brittle when we know where to look. I like to examine how philologists' translations of gender actions have evolved as modern concepts of gender have evolved, in order to show just how outsized an influence modern perceptions of gender have on our understanding of texts. Statius's Accolade provides a good example. In the Accolade, Achilles has been hidden on the Isle of Scuros in order to avoid the Trojan War, and has been transformed into and is living as a woman. The work, by its very nature, forces each translator to confront Achilles' complicated and fluid gender, and each translator provides a different solution. I find the differences very illuminating. Comparing these three different translations, Mausley's is from 1928 and provides the most heroic of our three Achilles. Here he keeps the valence really manly and nearly avoids evoking gender, translating this phrase, "relax thy mighty spirit." Shackleton Bailey's 2004 translation tends to emphasize boyhood and obedience, provides the translation, "lower your manly." Lower implies a sense of superiority, a sense of moving into something that is lesser in this action, and Lombardo embraces gender entirely, "be a little less manly now." In this next example, Mausley translates the verb disroxy in a fairly neutral manner, drew from. Shackleton Bailey provides diverted, implying that Achilles' choice has moved him away from the proper path, but that returning remains possible, while Stanley Lombardo runs gender right off the rails, here providing derailed is his translation. In this final example, each of these translators describes Achilles' future feminine clothing very differently. Mausley's, soft raiment and dishonorable garb, keeps the tone within the masculine world of honor. Shackleton Bailey emphasizes that Achilles wearing feminine clothes might do damage to the boy, emphasizing the possible shame, effeminate and degrading. And Lombardo's translation jumps straight to dresses and shameful feminine attire, an image that cannot avoid the cultural connotations provided by the trope of a man in a dress. Presented with the challenges of Achilles' multivalent fluid gendered expression in the Accolade, each translator defaults to modern images, familiar to readers today, but alien to the ancient text. Mausley's Achilles is the male hero. Shackleton Bailey is the obedient schoolboy, and Lombardo gives us the man in a dress. Gender's invisible presence is keenly felt across these three translations. Yet without comparison, these differences remain hidden. Since gender is a hyperobject, we cannot see the impact gender has outside of individual localized expressions. Providing intentional comparisons between different moments of gender is so very important. But if writing the history of gender is so fraught and difficult, writing transgender history is even more complicated. How does one transgender? And what does it even mean to write trans histories? Within classics, two very different volumes have recently provided polar opposite answers to this question. In 2017, the first volume explicitly dedicated to the question of trans identities within the classical world was published: Trans Antiquity, Cross-Dressing, and Transgender Dynamics in the Ancient World. Trans Antiquity quickly sets out the terms for its engagement with both transgender and history. It is clear that a transgender identity has existed only since the last decade of the 20th century. Nevertheless, in classical antiquity, it is possible to identify forms of behavior and action which might fall into our modern category of transgender. Taking transgender as, quote, modern performative gender self-reassignment, end quote, and relying on the importance of surgery, hormones, and modern conceptions of a gender change to define transgender, in trans antiquity, transgender becomes nearly unusable in past contexts. Alison Surtees and Jennifer Dyer's Exploring Gender Diversity in the Ancient World takes the opposite approach to trans antiquity. And rather than trying to deny that trans as a category existed, the introduction declares, the essays in this volume show that classical Greek and Roman history is the history of all genders. In a similar vein, the chapters in this section entitled Transgender Identity use a comparative approach, tying modern categories and definitions back to Greco-Roman antiquity in order to generate meaning. These chapters show various ways in which contemporary definitions of identities can be applied to make the past more legible. These two volumes frame an important question. How do we balance the alterity of the past, the foreign differences that we cannot understand from another time and another place, with the need for legibility in the present? I find that this question currently drives the study of transgender individuals and stories in classical studies. Yet, I believe that this entire argument around legibility or alterity is built upon a false premise. For while homosexual, queer, or various iterations of trans might indeed be modern concepts that cannot be mapped onto the past, so are the concepts of man, woman, self-identity, and even the body. If gender is the story we use to categorize ourselves, to categorize what it means to be human, to transgender is to move outside of and beyond the system of categorization that ties certain bodies to certain categories in order to make them legible. Undoing gender and stepping outside of categorization allows us to reframe the axis of alterity versus legibility, and instead focus on the ways that these texts, their language, and their underlying symbolic world create social norms and hierarchical structures. To conclude, I'd like to briefly use Megillos from Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans in order to explore a trans reading that steps outside of this alterity legibility question. In this dialogue, Leina narrates her sexual encounter with two women, Demonassa and Megilla. Leina explains that in the midst of Demonassa, Megilla's, and Leina's sexual encounter, Megilla removed a wig and declared himself a man by the name of Megillos. The remainder of the dialogue is spent interrogating and navigating the confusion caused by this moment. Readings of Dialogue 5 have heavily engaged with the question of alterity versus legibility. Megillos has been labeled a pomosexual, a modern-style lesbian, someone queer, a butch woman, and provided with the literal diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Other scholars have pushed back against using modern labels to discuss Megillos's identity and rejected reading the text as having any basis in, quote, real sexual practices. Rather than engaging with this growing set of questions around labeling and legibility, I'd instead like to draw our attention to how gender is functioning in the background of the story. When Megillos takes off his wig and declares himself a man, the narrative breaks. The action stops, quite literally, since we are in the midst of a sex scene, and is followed by an extended description of Megillos's new appearance. Leina expresses her shock, and Megillos asserts that the change is indeed significant. Don't make a man of me. My name is Megillos. Don't make a woman of me, sorry. My name is Megillos. I married Demonassa here a long time ago. She's my wife. After this, the narrative and tone shift dramatically, drawing our attention to the moment of Megillos's re-embodiment and a plea to be accepted as a man, and breaking the first half of the dialogue away from the second. This sudden shattering of gender norms becomes the central moment of the dialogue, making it, in my mind, a story all about categorization and how norms function. Now that Megillos has made a clear claim or plea to be recognized as a man, Leina strives to resolve her confusion at the unexpected and non-normative behavior. To do this, she first draws on an available store of myths, of potential excuses she can use to provide Megillos an exception to gender norms. She asks Megillos whether he is like Achilles, a man hiding as a woman, whether he is intersex like Hermaphroditus, or whether he has been transformed by the gods. None of these examples suffice. Megillos denies all three, saying, certainly not, Leina, but I was born similar to all you other women. I have the mind and the desire and everything else a man has. Everything, that is, but a penis. In the course of the story, Megillos claims that he has something instead, and so can claim the status of being male, and Leina is deeply uncertain if this could be true. The existence of these two competing claims prevents the symbolic crisis caused by Megillos's re-embodiment, his plea to be a male, from being resolved. The only way forward is to empirically test whether Megillos's claim is true. Megillos himself says in the dialogue, "Try me if you doubt." Very little attention has been paid to the concluding scene of the inset narrative, but I would contend that these sentences are in some ways perhaps the most important of the entire dialogue. First, notice how Demonassa has disappeared from the story entirely, leaving behind on its face a seemingly heteronormative pairing, Megillos being a male or trying to be a male, and Liaina. Then Liaina tests Megillos' claim to be a man, accepting him as a suitor, hearing him beg, accepting and exchanging gifts, and ultimately finding him lacking. You'll notice in this section that Liaina has already switched back to using feminine pronouns for Megillos, which is an interesting thing in those participles. Here, then, is the story of gender. We have a plea from Megillos to be recognized as a man, a plea which shatters expected norms, an attempt to fit the unexpected into established social categories by Liaina, and when that fails, a test that proves that Megillos does not live up to normative expectations, allowing Megillos to be safely excluded from the category of male. One final step remains, the act of socially policing gender categories. But the entire dialogue is framed as such, with Liaina promptly reporting to others the episode with Megillos, applying the public gaze to Megillos and attempting to police and negate his claim to identity. So the story of gender is the story of norms, exceptions, and exclusions, the story of how categories are created and maintained. In fact, I would contend that to write trans history is to write the history of categories. In the story of Megillos, we can start to see some of the ways this system of categorization worked in Greco-Roman antiquity. And in some ways, more importantly, Megillos' story reveals some of the ways that gender and its norms, exceptions, and exclusions functions differently in our world and our societies today. So coming back to the final thought, should we call Megillos trans? I do. For to step outside of gender and have your plea for identity rejected is a unique pain. I feel certain kinship there. Further, Megillos helps us to transgender, stepping across from it and attempting to view how vast it is. But most of all, I name Megillos trans as a matter of ethics and care. Following Hill Malentino in Trans Care, I see writing history as an act of caring for and nourishing people and supporting them. While queer, as we've heard here, can perhaps be discussed as a methodology, I find queer most valuable as an ethical identity, an ethics that seeks to find those who have been excluded, left behind, or lost. Undoing gender ultimately is a tool that I hope will allow me to write trans histories that provide, care for, and nourish trans lives in the here and now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kay, for this very passionate talk and very intriguing. And I'm sure we're going to discuss all these issues later. The fifth speaker of today is Giulia Sissa from University of California in Los Angeles. Her title is Queer Sensuality. Giulia.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Piril. I am grateful and delighted to be here. My name is Giulia Sissa, as Marco said. I have thought and written about Greek and Roman erotic cultures, more precisely sensuality, for quite a few years. Queer is a new classical music. I enjoy listening to it and I'm ready to sing along with one of my favorite poets, Agathon. Agathon was a wonderful playwright and a strikingly beautiful man. Aristophanes brings him on stage in the Thesmophoriazusae, dressed probably in saffron tunics and singing in a dulcet voice. Smart and refined in the eyes of the beholders, he looks utterly incongruous, a goodness. Here is how the beholder on stage, Euripides' kinsman, sees Agathon. And you, young lad, I want to ask you, ala Aeschylus Lycurgeia, what kind of female you are? Whence comes this femme? What's its homeland? What's its dress? What confoundment of living is this? What has a lute to chat about with a party dress, or a lyre with a hairnet? Here is an oil flask and a brassiere. How ill-fitting. And what's this society of mirror and sword? And you yourself, child, are you being raised male? Then where is your dick? Your suit, your Spartan shoes? All right, say you are a woman. Then where are your tits? Well, why don't you answer? Or must I find you out from your song, since you yourself refuse to speak? This is Henderson translation. Euripides' kinsman means to make the audience laugh, of course, but he is not less ludicrous, quite the opposite. The kinsman walks onto the stage as a hirsute, unpolished, rough, Agriotes man. What yokel draws nigh the rampart, asked Agathon's doorkeeper, and the kinsman, one who's ready to take you, and your poet who speaks beautifully and spin you around and bend you over, and up your rampart funnel this cock of mine, tutti topeos. To which Agathon's servant reacts in turn, old man, I can't imagine what a rapist hybristes you were when you were a boy. In his phallic reflex, the kinsman is going to assault the androgynous tragedian on the spot, if he has not done so already. He is a sort of sex machine. You have fucked him, Euripides tells him, but you probably don't even know. He is also very protective of this heinous. If anyone tries to wipe my horse for me, he'll be sorry. Rusticity is the first reason why this coarse male is laughable. The second one is boastfulness. The kinsman brags about his sexual stamina like the most conventional stock characters of ancient comedy, that of the Alazon. He makes a fool of himself by exaggerating his performance, like Lamachus, for instance, or the birds or other colorful braggarts. The third reason why he is utterly ridiculous, the kinsman, is his slow-witted naivete in front of the sophisticated poet. Wow, what is this hybrid creature? Is this either a man or a woman? One or the other, the regular guy wants to get it right. Like other comic characters, say Strepsiades in front of Socrates or the illiterate sausage seller, the kinsman is a befuddled ignoramus. Refinement register as indecipherability. The joke is on him. The comic stage does two things at once. It creates the polarity of mannish aggression versus effeminate subjection, and it does so in a way that is demeaning, disparaging, offensive. But contemptuous laughter targets both the tough macho obsessed with penetration and the nimbly mimetic poet intent on transforming, modulating, fine-tuning his embodiment. Agathon is good at creating female and male character, being equipped, as he says, both with his own body and with mimesis. Euripides' kinsman does not play a beau role just because he is active. He is boastful, beastly, and stupid. In the course of the play, he is the one, as we know, and From is with us, he is the one who will infiltrate the female crowd celebrating Demeter and Persephone. He will have to undergo depilation and cross-dressing, thereby exposing the masquerade of his virility. The uniform of masculinity comes and goes. His penis may well be attached to his groin, but when the women unmask it under the womanly attire, the kinsman moves in such a way that the paeos travels back and forth. Not exactly the God surgery on the original human beings in Aristophanes' speech in the Symposium, for they definitely transplanted the genitalia from back to front, but perhaps this is the idea. The phallus is transferable. But there is something more. Already while listening to Agathon's soft music, this super male himself is somehow affected by a tickling in his anus. What a pretty song, how femonstral, theludriodes, and tongue gagged and deep kissed. Kisses are super important here. Just hearing it brought a tingle to my very butt. Gargalos. Mockery of Agathon still, perhaps, but via a non-obvious detour, enough of predatory humor. Suddenly the bragging, bossy bloke has an instant of self-reflection, even of embodied irony. He feels Agathon's feelings under his skin. He shares his sensuous sensations. Sensuality is contagious. Gargalos. Let me take a moment to emphasize such an interesting expression of the phenomenal body. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes himself speaks about the gargalismos involved in his famous hiccup. The only remedy is a sneeze triggered precisely by tickling the nose. The verb is gnau. In the Phaedrus, at the version of the vision of the beloved, the soul of the charioteer is filled with the tickling and pricklings of yearning desire. Gargalismou tekai pothu kentron upeleste. Later in the same tradition, Philo of Alexandria, for instance, will claim that far from being tranquil, pleasure, and erotic pleasure, first of all, follows a tickling that is actually convulsive. Now, another word for tickling, knesmos, is the technical term used by the Hippocratic author of the treatise on generation when describing heterosexual intercourse. A kind of tickling sensation befalls the sexual apparatus. It gives rise to pleasure and warmth in the rest of the body. Now, for the medical writer, this sensorial experience is exactly the same for women and men. Sensuality is contagious. So what does Agathon's queer music do to us? It invites us to understand that not even comedy sustains the caricature of active versus passive. Sensorial experiences affect not the body, but parts of bodies, here and now. Localized sensitivities can be shared. Such a possibility creates reticular focalizations and transitive feelings that cut across the package of gender, moments of gender, I like that, and of any other form of ontic classification. By listening to Agathon, I see a felicitous convergence between the heuristic resources of, on the one hand, what we call new materialism, and on the other, the possibilities that a refreshed phenomenology of the erotic, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and the pages of Jean-Paul Sartre on the caresse are very important here. So a refreshed phenomenology of the erotic opens up for us. The phenomenon, ethical, is right there, but it can travel creatively, ironically. The macho is not forever macho. He too can have his moments, his epiphanies of mimesis. Erotic materialism is queer materialism. This hinges precisely on the phenomenon. Concrete, perceptible details draw our attention to the felt experience of lived bodies, in the plural. Bodies can be compared not as morphological totalities, but as bundles of multiple, discrete, movable qualities, ready to be mixed and remixed, allotted and exchanged. Qualities, namely bits and pieces of anatomy, manners, and garments, but also fragments of experience, instants of sensorial awareness. The logic of the concrete meets the phenomenal body. For the body is a challenge to be taken up in a time-sensitive, theatrical, even cinematic life, frame after frame, cut, freeze, and then montage. In this temporality, sensations can be shared across the boundaries of female and male, older and younger, which are adjectives, not substances. A granular, corpuscular, pointy yeast redistribution of traits, distinctive for the time being. This is what the Greeks have to tell us. Let us listen. I see queer readings at the convergence of 5 manners of thinking. Number 1, There is a logic of the concrete, the true deep ambition of structural analysis, which is not reducible to binarism. Differences move, intersect, and interchange. Distinctive traits like Agathon's glad rags can be borrowed for a day. Jacques Derrida has done the work for us. Like Plato's pharmacy, queer thinking unlocks text and images. Opposites become compossible in living metaphors. Paul Ricoeur is there too. We must pay phenomenological attention to the lived body in its partial objects and its sensations. Then we become attuned to what happens to embodied subjects, what affects them, not only to what is supposed to characterize them once and forever. We want to realize that female and male belong in a linguistic logic of predication. Gender, again, is not a substance. Gender is a range of available adjectives ready to be selected, combined, recombined, transferable by definition. Embodiment is also a language. A beard shouts, a stoic beard shout, I'm a man. A beard can be shaved. Yes, the Greeks have invented essentialism, but they have also been able to let poiesis, mimesis, and metamorphosis be. Yes, they have invented physiognomy and the idea of the character, but they have also experimented with the inexhaustible possibilities of characterizations on the theatrical stage. Yes, they have invented natural law, who must desire whom and for what purpose, but they have also been able to play with its provision. So sensuality, which means a cheerful, gratuitous subversion of the physiological family, is everywhere, from Homer to Melic poetry, to the theater, to the novel, to the philosophical situation. Far from mirroring social imperatives, Eros, the true tyrant, childishly laughs at the templates of power. Number 5, and how about us here and now? Queer sensuality means a horizon of possibilities for us, in Eve Sedgwick's words, the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances, and resonances. Possibilities to be converted into rights, rise to new configurations of kinship and conjugality, rise to modify one's body, rise to pick the words to tell or not one's preferred gender. Here and now. It also means to unleash the feminine, all the manners of being in the world that are encoded as feminine, from softness to sensitivity, from attention to vulnerability, find a paradigmatic legitimation. So Agathon's new music delivers us beautifully, cathartically, sensually from all the strictures and, pun intended, the structures, ancient and modern, of binary thinking. By whistling this mellifluous tone, I hope to have given a sense of what it can do for us, at least for me, here and now, and by the way, in the library. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Julia, for this. And yeah, as you might have noticed, we are late. So I propose to have just 3 minutes break for those of us who need to go to the toilet, drink a glass of water, and so on. So 3 minutes, 180 seconds. Okay, I'll see you in 3 minutes.
Interested in and can help us, for example, think about issues of value, but also issues of hierarchies and, you know, things like, for example, 4th century tragedy being worse than 5th century tragedy, just because we have these sorts of, you know, golden age ideas and certain temporary constructions that we still use. And so the work of queer theory around time, for example, can help us think about these power discourses around that, so it can go further. So one of the ways it can go further is precisely by using this corpus. We can think about things in a different way within the corpus. Now, there's a problem in this, or there's a potential problem in this, and that is that as soon as you stray too far, can it still be called queer? And I am of the people that believe that there's still potential in going as far as you like and running as far as you like, but it is true that I think that there has to be a certain anchor somewhere of some sort, to say certain gravitational pull that eventually in one way or another does tie into the gender sexual question. I don't think you can tie out the gender sexual question in any sort of normativity, but I think that that's one of the needs when one does queer theory in classics and elsewhere. So it can go beyond that, it can go outside of that by using it, by working through it. But I think that there is a danger in it becoming exclusively an intellectual job. If it is exclusively a work of theory, it forgets some of the ankling into subjectivities and lived lives, which helps in the end to erase precisely the subjectivities and the positions that it was trying to bring to light. I hope that made sense, my rambling, but those are my additions to that.
I'm back on that. It's still too broad for me because in a certain sense, tragedy is all about the lack of normativity in human relations, I was just trying to think, and that what David Halperin was saying is that everything we needed to know about thinking about different gender and sex was already in our texts from Plato and way before Plato. The only thing I can't, and virtually where humans mate with animals, every kind of, in a certain sense, what we see as abnormal is played with in myth, in which you have free reign of the imagination. Men can give birth to children, as Zeus can do this. Gods have different powers. And so I have a level of confusion in just the broadness of the term. And as you say yourself, it is something that one could worry about. Is that by the time you extend it to everything, it swallows up everything, what are you left with? It makes sense. And what Julia said about individual lives is not so much what we have, what we are privy to. We are privy to the representation of human lives, and not in a sense as they're lived in today, when we have choices and different attachments and different nomenclatures.
Froma, there's a very easy way to capture this. The great advantage of the word queer is there's nothing specific to which it refers.
Yeah.
And the great disadvantage of the word queer is there's nothing specific to which it refers.
Exactly.
That's both what's good about the term and it's what's bad about the term. And so there's no safety in the term at all. It really has to do with, everything depends on what you use it for. And as you point out, to say that tragedy is queer is not to say anything at all, because tragedy is what happens for the Greeks when things go wrong, when something bad happens. So if you use the word queer to refer to anything that's bad, well, of course, everything tragic is queer. So it's both obvious and uninformative. You have to make the word do some work.
But I think that work can be done and is being done. I don't frontally disagree with that position. I do think there's some reality in it. However, I do think that at the same time, tragedy plays a role within 5th century Athens, in which it also reifies specific norms and specific social norms. This is the problem, the problem with Medea, by Medea being a bad woman. Is she creating a fissure, or is she establishing the norms that have been created before? And she's doing both in a way. But there is a sort of dance between the norm and the queer that precisely has to be untangled. It has to be worked through. It has to be brought out. And also, I agree with the idea of there being of our Greek texts already doing the queering. However, they have been read in such a normative way for so long that I think that they cannot be detached from their normative readings, and therefore the text becomes in some sort of way normative. So one of the things that queer theory can do is precisely disentangle these normative readings that are aligned with questions of heteronormativity, colonialism, progress, Western ideas, etc., etc. So I think in that sense, I think that it's a lot messier, and in the messiness, there is a place precisely for queer tools, or the tools of queer theory, to not unmess, but to look at the mess, if that makes any sense.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. I'm really sorry, but we need to stop. We started 10 minutes later, and now we have this 10 minutes, 15 minutes longer. So thank you so much to all of you, to the speakers, of course, for joining us, for offering us the opportunity to think about these issues. As I said, our goal, Periel's goal, is my goal as a representative of the GIKS, is to really reach a broad audience, and this is exactly what happened. So I'm really, really thankful to you and for this wonderful discussion. You will find this this event online, if you all agree, that I put it on YouTube. So thank you so much again, and I'll see you maybe next at the next roundtable of the GIKS. Thank you.
Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Periel.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Froma. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.